Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. At The Reason We Learn, we aspire to be part of the solution. The purpose of this show is to take a good, honest, potentially painful look at the way kids are being educated. We know we can do better, and this is where we'll talk about how. Let's learn something. Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Reason We Learn. I'm your host, Deb Philman. I am so excited for today's show. Before we get started, please go ahead and subscribe if you are not already a subscriber to this channel. Also, like and share this broadcast with others who might be interested in the topic we are covering today. This is a little different than my typical interview in that my guest is not directly working in education or for education or even in some field attached to education. She is more of what I would call an educator of adults. Of me, of you, I hope, of everyone out there who needs a solid grounding in philosophy for the times in which we are living. I have Kate Wand here with me. I am a subscriber to her channel. And I think if you take a look at her website in particular, which goes by the name Very Opinionated, she has a tagline right across that is my heart. The solution to a collectivist problem is an individual one. I've been following her for some time. I absolutely adore her work, read it religiously, subscribe to it, etc. I highly recommend that you do as well. She also has a fantastic collection of videos at her YouTube channel. And after some recent broadcasts, I thought to myself, I need to talk to her because I think we're aligned. As the title says, there's no one coming to save you. No one is coming to save you.
There's no one coming to save you.
No, but I want you to tell us a little bit about your background, how you decided to take to the airwaves and start writing, and what motivates you. Tell us a little bit about all of that.
Well, thank you so much, Deb. I'm really happy to be here too. And I love your work as well. And I do think that we are very, very aligned. I was listening to one of your shows the other day, and that's exactly what you were talking about, how we have a collectivism problem, right? And so I don't know where to begin. I guess you can trace it as far back to as me growing up, always being this kind of independent thinker and black sheep, not really going with the herd, always questioning things, always challenging things. And that was in my family home, that was at school, that was in my friendship groups as I grew older. I was always kind of a status quo disruptor in a way, and a very, a good student. So I was doing really well in school and all of that, but I always had a lot of questions, and I was a critical thinker. And of course, I was going to school in a different era than now. When children are being educated, it's a very different environment. I was going to school. I'm born in '87, so 90s, 2000s, that was kind of like the cusp of when things really started to change, I think. I mean, it can go back earlier than that, but I think in education, it was still kind of the end of the golden age. Um, so I guess fast forward to 2020, and at that time, I was just, had just bought a house with my husband, our first house. We said, we're going to have a family. We're going to homeschool our kids. We're going to live in the country. We're going to just kind of find our shire. And because we already saw that there were problems, and we were just kind of like autodidacts, both of us. So just reading about, collectivism, about philosophy, about psychology, about history, about macroeconomics. We were kind of on this journey together, him and I, from around 2018 on. And this was kind of continuing from our life before we met each other and we started to do this stuff together, where we were just kind of trying to figure out the world as it was and look at the past to inform us more. So we like to do that. We like to read books. We like to watch good podcasts and things like that. And so what happened in 2020 was we had just purchased our home. My husband was an airline pilot. I was a music teacher. So I was teaching students, privately, and it was really great. I loved it. And I could see the effect of the culture on them. This indoctrination was already happening, in numerous ways. This kind of like cultural revolution. I live in Canada, so it's very intense. And we can talk
Mhm.
about that maybe a bit later if you like.
Sure.
And so I kind of like doing, the private teaching because it allowed me to be outside of kind of a regular curriculum. And when 2020, that kind of Pandora's box opened, I just felt compelled to speak about things.
Sure.
and
I know
and
that feeling, actually.
yeah, it was bigger than me. And so I just, I had some thoughts about what I saw as kind of the aviation crisis in Canada. And so I just put out a video on YouTube because I couldn't find any information about it. And prior to that, I was recording music. My husband has a background in cinema. And so we were just kind of using our skills and combining that together creatively to do music videos and to do educational music videos for some of my students while they were in lockdown. And then I just said, let's turn on the camera and talk about something else. So that's kind of where we began to kind of come into the public sphere with these kinds of ideas, which were already things that we were interested in, that we were reading about, that we were learning about, that we were just taking in, but I wasn't really talking about it publicly yet.
So would you say then that you looked at what was going on and thought, if only these people looked at it differently or understood something differently, they might have different opinions or might react differently to what's happening. Um, and then did you have sort of an impulse to tell them, almost like a crier, like, "Hey guys, wait a minute.
Yeah.
What have you considered this? Maybe you should look at it a different way or ask different questions," because that's what I felt. I was
Mm,
watching people and it felt like the visual in my head was I'm standing there, not at a cliff, but sort of near one. Let's say you're walking down the Pacific Coast Highway or something similar, and you see all these people just running
mhm,
towards the edge. And you're standing there, um, it's a cliff. Did hello? Are you aware that when the gravity, at least that's sort of how I felt was they just need more information. If
mhm,
they just could
mhm.
know what I've been reading or what I've been seeing, we could stop this. At least that was my naive thought. I don't know if you had thoughts like that.
I totally did. I totally did at the beginning. And I was actually I was naive also, is a good word. I thought, I didn't realize to what degree we already had a collectivist problem. And so I thought, information can change people's minds. Education can change people's mind. Philosophy can, but a lot of people don't want to do this stuff. A lot of people don't do this stuff and they have no desire to do it. And so it kind of followed a pattern actually that I had kind of experienced throughout my life, throughout my childhood, of being able to kind of see things in a different way and having nobody around me really understand what I was talking about. It was kind of it was kind of the same thing. So it's like this desire to save people with ideas in a way, and to just kind of open up the lens, for the people around you. This was something that I was kind of familiar with. And so you always, you have this kind of um this this bias sometimes of thinking that the people around you think like you. You think like they must see, I was surprised, I was shocked that people were supporting lockdowns, for example. And then I was like, "Oh yeah, this it makes sense." So I think that that was kind of at the beginning. It was like I just need to talk about these things because they're important and no one else is really talking about them that I see, this particular first topic that I touched on. And then it became um uh, about creating videos that exposed kind of what I saw as like psychological mechanisms and psychosocial mechanisms of what we were experiencing. So like one of the next videos that we had done was on the Milgram experiment, about how people, they will do what the authority tells them to do to the point where they will actually kill somebody, and
Mhm.
they will do it without really understanding what they're doing. So I just, I don't really know if after the beginning, that kind of naivete, if I was still driven to try and change people's mind, or if I just felt like it was important to create. Like I just, you know, needed to create, and my husband as well, and that's kind of how we both felt. And I was pregnant at the time. So all of
You
our
were
early
creating.
yeah, and all of our early videos were voiceover, so it was really funny, like nobody really knew, but I was also creating life inside of me at the same time. So I had this sense of urgency as well, I think, as a mom, as becoming a mother, to say like, I want my baby to grow up in a world where he sees faces. And that it was, so there was like some different psychological incentives for me too, I think, to do that. I thought it was important, to not be on the sidelines of what I saw as this kind of like existential battle between going further down this collectivist path, further down the road to serfdom, really. We could talk maybe a bit about Hayek later.
Yeah.
And stopping and saying, okay, where are we going with all of this?
Yeah. And I can relate to both of those things, sort of the initial desire to just talk about these things and get it out of, get it out of you, the sort of
Hmm.
naive thought that maybe ideas would change people's minds or kind of wake them up, so to speak, if they're in a little bit of a trance. I truly believed that most people were just not thinking, they were leading with their emotions, fear principle among those, which is pretty toxic if you let that take hold. And that just somebody needed to kind of snap out of it, right? So I was giving people a lot of credit. I also had to get it out. But then, like you, I mean, my youngest is 15. I have one in college, one bound for college, and just I same. I thought I don't want to be that silent person where my kids someday say, "Why didn't you do something? Why didn't you say something?" And they don't want to hear about it constantly. They already know what I think. They live with me. So I thought, well, let me just put it out there for other people's parents. And I also recognize that they can't just be all alone in this world,
Hmm.
right? I don't know if you felt like this, but I didn't like feeling alone in my thoughts. And you had your husband, I have my husband, and we both, similar thing, we're aligned. But I thought to myself, if I feel a little bit lonely in this, realization, I bet there are other people out there who do too. So another motivation was to bring people together of like mind. So they didn't
Hmm.
need necessarily persuasion. They needed more to be reminded that they're not crazy, because what can happen sometimes when you're living in this kind of crazy world is you start to think, maybe I'm the crazy one. Like you start to second guess yourself
Yeah.
depending on how steeped you are or attached you are to your principles. And on the off chance that there were people out there on the fence, or there are people thinking, maybe I should just go along with it and maybe I am the wrong one here, which is can be very tempting. Social pressure is very powerful. And especially for those who are getting it in their own homes, which
Hmm.
was happening a lot. So I thought, well, maybe I can help. Maybe I can just be a voice that makes them feel less alone. So that was sort of another factor involved with that. But did you have that too? That sense that like maybe at least I can gather around, gather the circle together, not for an echo chamber, but to be individualists together trying to pierce the echo chamber, if that makes sense. I didn't want to
Yeah.
form a club. I just wanted individuals out there to feel less susceptible to being dragged down into the crab bucket.
Yeah, well, I did feel that. And I think, people were being gaslit by, the institutions and by the authorities. And they were also being gaslit by the people around them. And that's like a large part of collectivism. It's a symbiotic relationship between the government, the governing authorities, the institutions, and the masses who want it, who want more of that. Right. And so I think it was important to show up truthfully in life, and to not not for any kind of utilitarian reasons of saying, oh, I think that like I'm going to save the world and I'm going to change the world around me and that's why I'm doing it, but because I had to be honest with myself and hope that a side effect of that is that people are going to get inspired by that themselves. Like I live in a small community, and so and I'm not in a big city, and it's kind of more conservative and it's more traditional in a lot of ways. And so it was also important for me in my direct community, like to go out there and not wear a mask was one thing. And like I got a lot of pushback for that. And I was pregnant, and people were crazy, and they would scream at me and they would chase me down the aisles of the grocery store. And I would get in trouble from management at grocery stores and things like that. And I would just tell them, look, no, no, no. The other guy just abused me, and you should go talk to him. So it was kind of about being truthful and staying moored in my principles, and that would also kind of give courage to the people around me as a byproduct of that. So I had a lot of acquaintances and friends in the area who saw that and who were able to kind of come out of their own sense of oppression, to be like kind of feel relieved, like, okay, Kate's coming into the shop. I can take my mask off my chin, like put it on my chin. There
Right.
was that. It was important. And I'll tell you actually a great story I think you'll appreciate too. I was I was about to give birth. Actually, it was like a couple of weeks away, and I had gone into like a little local shop, and was talking with a friend who worked there, and a woman came in, and she had a 6-month-old baby in a carriage with her. And we had really long lockdowns and restrictions and everything, like in Canada, in Ontario. It was, I think, the longest in the world. I remember Michael Singer talking about that in his book. And so it was just really tough on people. And nobody wanted to not do what they were told. They felt very afraid from the social pressure and getting in trouble from any authority figure. And so this woman comes in, she has a mask on, she has a 6-month-old baby in a carriage, and she's, walking with her baby, and she's overhearing me talking to my friend. I'm big pregnant belly. I'm just talking to her about all the craziness that's going on, and just being a dissenter, just vocally and out there. And I wasn't obnoxious about it, I don't think, but we were just having a conversation about the going ons. And she was kind of scared at first, you could tell. She was like, "Oh my god, here's like an anti-masker in the store." And then it was funny, she kind of did her rounds around the store, and then she came up to us, and she was like, "Look, I just wanna tell you that it's kind of nice to hear what you're saying." And and then we started talking, and I communicated with her daughter. Like, can you imagine like a mom and her baby? Like her baby's not even getting to see her mom's face, And I said, it's important for me to do all of these things because again, like I want my baby to grow up in a world where he sees smiles. Like this is going to affect him a lot. I don't want him to go out there in the stores and see people wearing masks. I don't want that. And it's not a scientific question. It's not about the efficacy of masks or the studies about this or that. It's about principles. It's about principles of what should other people be able to tell you what to do with your body. Whether it works or not is irrelevant. Is that individual autonomy to be able to decide what is best for you.
Sure.
And that's the individualist thing. That is the piece there that's really central. And so we were talking, and you could tell that her wheels were turning, and she left. And then I think it was like that week that I gave birth to my son, like, or 2 weeks later, maybe. And then I went to go see my friend at her store after that, the first time I came out. And she said, "You know what? I have something for you. The lady who was in the store, she was so touched by your conversation that she came back into the store with this gift for you." and she had bought me a book, and it was a book, In a May's Guide to Childbirth or something like that. And it was a book that she had really enjoyed. And so it was like, it was such a nice moment, because I think like what happened is that people were just kind of detached from their humanity in so many ways, and the mask was symbolic of that. But it was also that they were like that unity of like socializing with people and just being humans together, and not dehumanizing the other on either way. And you see a lot of collectivism as well, I think, in the so-called freedom movement, which we can get
Right.
into,
Which I
you
definitely
know.
want to talk about. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but I think that it started there. There was this idea that like we are superior because we get it, because we get that this is all a scam or whatever it was, and like dehumanizing other people. But like neither me or the other lady were dehumanizing each other, but we were
Right.
on completely different sides of this issue. So,
Right. And I think you
yeah.
can people have said to me, but what about the people, the haters or the people who come at you guns blazing and they try to do things and I'm not going to lie and say it doesn't hurt, it doesn't frustrate me, but my overriding sense is I feel sorry for them, and that's not me saying I'm superior. It's that I know that they are not operating in reason,
Mhm.
and that means that they've allowed something to take over their mind, or their mind is gone for all intents and purposes. They're not truly alive. And it makes me terribly sad, because if they continue down that path for any number of years, it's not just the people around them like me, who might get hurt by their behavior. They will too. Nobody comes out of that situation whole. And they're actually already living in a kind of hell, because imagine living your life on eggshells, or constantly evaluating what comes out of your mouth, what comes off your pen or your keyboard, or even just evaluating every thought and feeling you have based on how it's going to be perceived or reacted to or whatever. Human beings make mistakes too. Um, and as you point out, that we've lost that when you give up that humanity or outsource it to an authority figure. You sort of cease to be. A piece of you ceases to be. You are still there, but not completely. And it's terribly sad. And I love that story, because I think what it shows too is that when individuals connect with other individuals, that spell for can be broken very quickly, very, very
Yes.
quickly. Did you ever see the film with Gregory Peck, To Kill a Mockingbird? Did you
I
ever see the
never
Greg?
saw it.
Oh, okay. Well, I
I'll
don't think
have
this
to
is
watch it.
particularly a spoiler, but this is relevant. There is a scene in there, and I'm not gonna tell you which one it is, but you'll find it when you see the film. There's a scene where Scout, the little daughter, demonstrates this so beautifully that, she and her father are faced with like a mob
Hmm.
with that mentality, and she picks one out by name. "Hi, Mr. So and so," like this, and just starts
Hmm.
interacting with him as a human being, not to do with why they're there or anything like, just kind of like starts interacting by name, and then starts interacting with another one by name. So individuating them in that simple confrontation, and it's all it took to de-escalate the situation. So I think, what you did was great, and I think you gave her a gift in a way, because and she obviously saw it that way, and gave you a gift in return, because it does break that spell and it returns the person to themselves. It's not that you did it does ultimately protect you also, but first and foremost, you gave her back herself.
I think that's such a beautiful point, Deb. It's you're taking away layers that, people become like calcified with groupthink. Um,
Yeah.
as you said, they're not thinking for themselves anymore. They're not really thinking. They're just kind of following. And that's where you get that idea of the herd, right? And
Right.
Jeffrey Tucker had written a great piece at the very beginning of all of this, saying, quoting Charles Mackay, people go mad in herds, but they come to their senses one by one, slowly. And that's exactly how it is. And this is how we see things now. And I think that a lot of people who have maintained this kind of very defensive stance of being like diametrically opposed to people who went along with the kind of governing narratives over what's been going on the past few years. It's kind of a mistake because it doesn't allow you to make those individual connections with people, and that just keeps you separate and it keeps you tribal, and that is contributing to the problem and contributing to this kind of ascending collectivism.
Right.
It didn't stop when, you know, kind of mandates and restrictions and things went away, and like people just focused on kind of retribution over all of that. They're they're still perhaps dehumanizing the other, and that's just going to get us further down the road of exactly what those people didn't want in the first place.
Exactly. And I think people are right to want to hold individuals accountable who had literal power over them, and
Oh yeah.
if especially if they are refusing to acknowledge their mistake. Now, for those who acknowledge their mistake, I think it was Brett Weinstein who acknowledged, I was incorrect.
Hmm.
I believed this science and then I, came around. I have, nothing but grace for them because they acknowledge it. I messed up. I shouldn't have done it. Now, one thing you can probably count on is that's not something that person's going to repeat. So
Hmm.
when you give somebody an opportunity to redeem themselves, I believe they're more inclined to be thoughtful next time. And one of the problems I have with the collectivism that it seems to be sweeping our Western culture, it's not just America, it's not just Canada, it's Western culture in general, is the complete absence of redemption. It's not
Hmm.
interested in changing your mind. It's not interested in uh forgiving you. So even if you did make a mistake and you wanted to sincerely apologize for something, that's not what anyone is looking for. They are looking for power. And it's a kind of power that doesn't really empower individuals to improve their lives. It's this kind of false power in numbers, this idea that I am safe because other people agree with me. Lots and
Hmm.
lots of other people agree with me. It's a false safety. But more importantly, I think, and I imagine you agree with this, it's an ever moving target. It's not grounded in principle. So it's just shifting, and there's no end to it. The people setting that narrative that you need to follow to be in the group, in the
Hmm.
collective, have to maintain whatever that heightened sense of I'd rather trade my humanity, trade my individual rights, my individual thoughts and autonomy to have the thing, whatever the thing is. And generally it's some kind of safety. I'll trade that out for this. So they have to keep the need for security going. That means we have to keep crises going. We have to keep danger going. We have to start wars. We have to, there's another disease. And so they're not protecting themselves from anything. And it's so painful to sit there and look at even a symbol. I bet this has happened to you too. You'll just see a symbol, a marketing campaign, an ad on TV, just a sound bite, and you immediately have gone through all 4 or 5 layers, all the way to what the likely outcome is en masse
Hmm.
because people didn't go through that thought process. And you get frustrated at a symbol. And then people are like, don't you think you're overreacting? And here's the catch. This drives me nuts. You talked about the sort of anti-woke, the freedom movement, the anti-woke right, whatever.
Hmm.
So now you have to guard against being accidentally aligned with that side of the collectivism, where somebody interprets your very quick analysis, because now you're practiced at it. You can see this is propaganda. This is propaganda. Oh, you're just knee jerk reacting because that's from the other tribe.
Hmm.
And you have to, and now you're like backtracking, trying to explain. This just happened to me the other day. You probably saw it. And nobody wants to believe you. You're rationalizing, you're this, you're like, no, I honestly have just gotten so attuned to propaganda and agitprop that it jumps out and smacks me in the face. And then I have 2 choices. I can do like so many people did during COVID and keep my mouth shut about it, lest someone say, you're just over here on this
Yeah.
team, the anti team, or I can say something about it and have the team I'm criticizing get mad at me. What do I do? And that's where I decided, and I'm not going to bring up the specifics, I don't want to bring it up again, but I decided, as I often do, and as I'm sure you do, to just live in truth and
Yeah.
just say, this is how I'm reacting to this, and I'm going to go ahead and have the conversation come what may. Now, obviously, there are more elegant ways to do it. You are, I think, a pro at taking your time to think about the way to express that analysis across all your platforms. So kudos. I need to take a lesson on that. But I also think we as a society probably need to give each other a little bit more grace. And right now I see this, like when you talk the freedom camp and that's not really about freedom. And then the
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
collectivist camp, they're just different tribes, it feels like
Yes.
to me.
Yes. Yes. Well, I think, it's funny because like when for me, and like if you're comfortable with me talking about it, it was like really October 7th that we saw that the tribes really became clear.
Yes.
And when you're not in a tribe, I mean, and we are tribal, like humans are tribal, but we have evolved from that with certain principles,
Right.
including redemption, including critical thinking and reasoning, but also um having compassion for others and having empathy for others. So it's not just um a rational thing. Like it's a human thing, of like overriding tribal instincts to be able to kind of see when you're getting pulled into tribalism.
Mhm.
But I think that, like I've been thinking a lot about the 20th century tribalism, and
Mhm.
like the rise of the far left and the far right. And those are maybe like not the right way of explaining them. People will say, "Oh, the left is just like the right, or they turn into each other." But yes, they do. They do. So like it doesn't really matter if you want to use the term right or left, but of seeing these two kinds of reactionary tribes.
Right.
And this is what I kind of I fear is happening now. We've seen, let's just use the term far left. We've seen the wokeism being the kind of prevalent tribe, having the most institutional power, having the most media power, having the most governmental power, having the most power in NGOs, in corporations over the last few decades, coming up slowly. And then suddenly, and then the reaction to that is like a whole other kind of tribe. And, like my husband came up with this analogy and I thought it was hilarious. I think you might like it and your guests might like it too. So like when October 7th happened and we were looking at this whole situation like through a human lens and not a tribal lens, and couldn't completely understand what was going on yet, but understood enough to be like, I feel immense, like soul ripping sadness and anger and sorrow and like all of these crazy complex emotions, like grief for everybody who was victim on that day, and people as a whole, and wanting to talk about that, but then seeing like immediately I was getting attacked on my YouTube channel, for example, on different platforms. I lost a lot of people who were on board with everything else that I was talking about. And I would talk about individualism and philosophy and trying to, but it was like the message got lost somehow. They just kind of maybe saw me as like a member of their tribe. And so
Yes.
then like when my ideas and perceptions didn't align anymore, it was like this attack. And so it was very tough. And I felt like I was being scapegoated. And I've experienced that before. So it was really triggering for me. And I was like, oh man, here we go again. And I just wanted to kind of like prove myself, prove that, like, something. I didn't even know what I wanted to prove. I just didn't want to be attacked by the people that, I guess, me too. I'm not immune to feeling part of a tribe. We all have that. So being like the people who used to like my videos, now they're like saying nasty things to me, and like just, I couldn't believe it. It was such like ad hominem personal attacks. And so the analogy my husband had was like, basically what we're doing right now, Kate, is we're like, going to this to a baseball stadium, and there's two teams, and we're standing outside of the stadium, and like everybody who's coming into the stadium, we're like, "Hey guys, you know, sports who cares which team wins or loses, like just buy my CDs, like sports are stupid and tribal, just like." So we were kind of laughing because we were like, it felt strange to be like, oh, that's when you see um the distinction of being an individualist in a collectivist world, that like it was very like a very palpable feeling. And I have a great friend and I guess colleague of mine in a way. We've done so many podcasts together. Bruce Party, who's a law prof at Queen's University, and he's a great figure, who's been really principled in the last few years, and writes a lot and speaks out a lot. And he was there on the defense of the truckers, and speaking to the public about that. And he says basically, and we've done a podcast on this, so I can like send it over to you that if you want to link it
Sure.
below.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he talks about how most people think that there's only two groups. Like, so like, let's say we just say the right and the left.
Right.
They think like, there's only the left, and they think there's only the right, there's only us. And then there's like the classical liberals or the libertarians, like what Hayek would call the liberals of the old kind. And Hayek talks about this. He says there's one kind of mind that the fascists and the communists cannot get to, and it's the liberal of the old type, because he says they become each other. And so they don't see that there's another group of people there who are like, no, I don't do the group thing, and it doesn't mean that I don't have groups in my life. It doesn't mean that I don't have groups of friends, or that does it, but it just means that I don't do the tribal political group thing. So that was kind of a strange kind of like cold water in the face experience, to be like, oh yeah, we're really not, we're really not part of this tribe. And I guess it was important to also like check our premises for my husband and I, and be like, okay, are we seeing things like, let's not get pulled into what, what seems to be more like our tribe, or people who have been aligned with a lot of the ideas that we've had over the last few years. Like, okay, is this true what they're saying? Is this true what they're saying? What do I think? What do I actually think? I think that's the kind of insulation that you have to have from groupthink, is what are my impressions about this? What does my gut say? What does my intuition say? Okay, now let me try and reason through it. Let me also emote through it. Let me see like, how do I feel about this? Like what, and your feelings sometimes misguide you, but sometimes they can lead you in the right direction as well. So,
Yeah. My friend Barbara says that she, from a very early age, realized you have to have the right facts to have the right feelings.
hmm,
And the way she explains it is not to say that your feelings or your gut are wrong, because as you point out, sometimes the reason you have a feeling is to let you know that you're going down the wrong path because you're not being guided by reason. So, I mean, we have all different kinds of emotions, but if you're, especially in a situation of intense discomfort,
hmm,
if you're not taking a step mentally, even for a half a second, to say, okay, why do I feel this way? And what's activating me so much about this situation? You certainly run the risk of expressing an emotion, even feeling emotion that can, wreck your day, wreck your month. I mean, can wreck a relationship. Um, because from those come actions, words, all kinds of things. And if it's based, as you said, on facts that aren't even facts, right? That person walking around without the mask, as an example, if the facts you were given are they're typhoid Mary,
yeah,
simply because they haven't
yeah,
covered half their face with a piece of cloth, and you believe that, if you take that as the science or science at all, um, and you then base your emotions on it, well, you're basing your emotions on something that actually isn't factual. So
Mm.
who told me that? You talked about the Milgram experiments. Who told me that? Why did they tell me that? Why might they tell me that? Does that square with the reality I see before my eyes? That was one of the things that got to me
Mm.
during that time was I tried to check things against reality that I observe. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, if something is that contagious and that deadly, we would see it. I mean, you'd see, like you'd see people passing out or dying. You would hear about people you knew dropping like flies. We've read about epidemics before,
Mhm.
even the Spanish flu pandemic, where somebody who got up in the morning, walked somewhere, and then by that night they were dead. I mean, we've read about this. Doesn't mean every disease does that, but one worthy of depriving people of their civil rights, let's say. And I was thinking to myself, like, the evidence doesn't stack up. My own eyes and my own ears and everything that I'm studying, I'm looking at the math, I'm looking at all the things, and it doesn't match. So I'm not going to be afraid like that. I'm not going to be tolerant of this or that, the other. And I found that a lot of people didn't do that. They don't need much in terms of what you might consider factual. And what they call a fact is really not all that much more than a feeling. And this is what I feel like with the tribes is that, as you pointed out, we do choose to belong to different groups, clubs, associations, friendship groups, and sometimes they might even align with an ethnic origin or something tradition that we want to uphold. But I think the difference between doing that voluntarily because it enriches your life and it
Mm.
uplifts, uh, and doing it as a shield against others or as a measuring stick against which to measure the value of others and their opinions and their existence is where we're going awry. So that if somebody expresses an opinion and you don't either are confused by it or don't like it, disagree with it, and your first reaction, we saw this after October 7th, which probably happened to you. Oh, you probably think that because you're a this, or you're
Yeah.
best friends with so and so, that explains it. Or
Yeah.
are you suggesting you agree with the ADL and about, forcing people to, and it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. So
Yeah.
why would you assume that? And the only reason someone would assume that is if they think, it's a false cause fallacy, but you believe A, therefore
Yes.
it's
B
because
must
of
be true.
B is because of that.
Oh,
And
yeah, yeah.
And this is what I see. I get it all the time. I had the same experience as you. I had an early wave of people. Yeah, this is great content. This is great content. And then I would start questioning some of the responses like, let's ban CRT
Mhm.
as an example in the schools. Let's
Mhm.
ban this, let's ban that. And I'm like, time out. Hello, whoa, no, no, no.
Yeah.
And I would get that, what? Are you one of those commie blah, blah, blahs? And it's like, so you've been watching me for a solid year, listening to everything I've said about individualism, about Marxism, about collectivism, all the philosophical ideas. I mean, I read the Comperchicos chapter by chapter into the microphone. And that's the conclusion that you come to. It really kind of gave me a chill. Like, have I been speaking into the void all this time?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
it's concerning. And that I think leads to what we were going to sit down and talk about today, which is the savior mentality. I feel
Mm.
like, and I think James Lindsay talks about this. You've got sort of one both sides, dominant sides, if we're going to call them that, left and right, okay,
Mhm.
seem to have the same kind of idea about how we, first of all, there's the we, not a I will fix this, and I want to talk to you about that, but how we will get out of whatever problem we perceive to be in, whether it's systemic racism or the Maoism and the Cultural Revolution that's taking over. Both sides are looking for some force outside themselves to save them en masse from
Mhm.
the top down. So I look at the left and it's like, rules and regulations and government, very massive government with lots and lots of ability and power to restrict the movements and thoughts and feelings of individual people on demand. That's their Superman, men, people, whatever, the global super force. And then on the right, I see it's more like a literal Superman, like this almost messianic kind of vision where they attach to an individual in most cases, or a couple of individuals, messianic-like powers where somehow they have powers not endowed to them by the constitution of their country or by voters, but anybody else, but just God sent them. Like they've been sent to save us. And I'm over here going, y'all do realize nobody's going to save you. There is no force big enough. There is no human godlike enough to fix what's going on here. And how do we address that?
I think that it's the way that it is. I think that most people think that way. And I think that there's a small percentage of people, maybe it's 20% of people.
That would be good. I've read you only need 3%.
Yeah, maybe it's less, but I think that there's a certain, a minority of people who are more like, okay, we can use the word individualist, but like maybe to define individualist, it's like people who believe that you should be able to do what is the best for you and for the people around you directly. And that's it. Like that's, basically individualist doesn't mean you're selfish. It doesn't mean you operate from your ego. It doesn't mean that you don't have family or community or that you don't give to charity or that you won't help out your brother if he needs help. That's not an individualist. Individualist is basically like, I, don't subscribe to this kind of like tribal group think, and I'm just going to try and do what's best for me and the people around me. And, that kind of trickles out and maybe we have a better society if more people kind of are individuated. It comes back to what you were saying before when the little girl points out, hi, over there, that's like individuation. Like I'm an individual. I'm not part of the hive mind,
Right.
I think maybe though to like reflect on your question, I don't know if I have an answer, but I was thinking of Lord of the Rings, right? Like there's always somebody who wants to use the ring of power for good. And now it's the right. But like a few decades ago it was the left, who wanted to take back the institutions from the right. And now we're here. It's like this, this kind of pendulum that swings back and forth. And any time that we've had the most kind of freedom and we've had the best prosperity and economic opportunity has been when we have like gone towards more kind of like classical liberal principles, like less intervention, less government power, more individual focused solutions, more free enterprise, like an opening up of things. Those are kind of like the classical liberal or the individualist kind of values, and they're inextricably linked with the economy. So like that's one thing that people I don't think talk about a lot. But as long as you have this kind of this humongous state, that needs to fuel itself with all of the taxes and the resources of the people, and the people want something from the state, they have all of these grievances and they want their grievances to be answered by the state, then you're going to have that. So I think that like part of it is that that's kind of the way that humans are, and that's the way that humans are in nations and in groups, and it's just kind of how it goes. And then we have these like little pockets of time where like the ideas that I think are better kind of win out, and so I don't really know. Like I don't know what can be done for people who think that way, because they might not want to think another way, but if they want to do so, it would be, I think, to the first thing I think that you would have to do would be to like ask yourself the question first. Like when something happens, instead of turning to go see what other people are saying about it, ask yourself what you think. Like that's like a very simple solution. Like, what do I actually think about this?
Right. Exactly.
And not need to like validate that, you could bounce your ideas off of other people, of course, that's important too, because it keeps you in check with reality, to have, we're social animals. So that's important. But the most important thing is like, what do I actually think about something? And
Right.
if you have problems trying to figure out what you actually think about things, well, then maybe you need to read. You need to learn more things. Like learn about different topics, learn about macroeconomics, learn about, different kinds of philosophies, learn
Right.
about psychology, start to individuate, like start to free your mind, from psychological projection all the time, start to like become more self-aware, like do the work for yourself. And then all of these kinds of things, it's a practice. And then that is going to kind of like free free your own kind of
Hmm.
world, allow you to be less dependent on what other people think. And then you can actually kind of like get a clearer picture for yourself. And then you also like, regardless of what's going on out there, you can also actually have a good life, like even if you're living and you had asked me to think about some of the things that I would recommend reading, before this podcast, and that would be like Viktor Frankl, Man in Search of Meaning. He was in concentration camps, and in the worst kind of experiences and the worst conditions for humanity and for the human mind, he saw like, what separates people who just totally like have their humanity stripped away from them is that they maintain their ability to have meaning, to look for something, to think, to like, you have to keep a hold of yourself, basically.
Yeah. I think one of the things that concerns me the most about education, especially with children right now, I mean, it's also a problem with adults, but it's hitting very hard in our schools. And I think this is true in Canada as well. I've seen some of the material is that we are denigrating knowledge itself. So you talk about, read, inform yourself, teach yourself, find out what you think about something and check it against some other information. But the tribalism has now gone to where sort of Mao took it. Interestingly enough, the Soviets didn't really do this. I mean, there's certain books that they wouldn't let you read, certainly, right? But you could still read a science book. You could read, books about physics or whatever. Um, if the person who documented the knowledge or produced the knowledge is of the wrong tribe, it's no longer knowledge. So that's what I'm seeing, is that we are now evaluating what is true and what is worth knowing based on who produced it. And children are being taught this message every single day, and they use terms like decolonize the curriculum, destruct texts to get rid of the classics. So we're erasing memory at a rapid clip. This is more Maoist. This is more Pol Pot. This is much more
Mm.
like the year zero type of people. And what concerns me about that is that, adults, we're adults. A child who's never introduced to the process of self-teaching and
Mhm.
checking their own thoughts will never do it. You don't just wake up one day and figure out how to do that. It can be stunted. I shouldn't say all children will never do that, but it will take a lot more intervention and inspiration to get you to do that. Certain neural pathways are just never going to form.
Hmm.
And I think that is what's so concerning to me, is that we're sort of, like Ayn Rand said in the Comparticos, we're hobbling their minds as much as if we put, the shoes they would put on Chinese babies to make their feet small. If you rein in their minds in such a narrow way to only certain kinds of literature, certain ways of looking at science, certain ways of looking at history, what would possibly be their motivation? And rather than asking the question of why are they so intent on me not reading that stuff, they're just not going to know it exists. So again, at least in the Soviet Union, it was like, that's forbidden, right? You can't read this and you can't read that. So there at least would spark in somebody like you or somebody like me,
Curiosity.
I wonder why, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's just being removed wiped away, never shown in the first place. It's not like option A, option B, and option B is really, really bad. You don't want to look at that. The kid might go, there is no option B. They've never heard of it. I can't tell you how many kids I run across, middle school, high school. You mentioned something that our generation, anywhere in the West, even in countries that don't speak English, might have heard of these titles, might have heard of these people. That's how famous they are. And you'll talk to a kid today and they're like, what's that? What do you mean? I've never heard of that. And my heart just breaks, because how do you reproduce the good of a culture and all the good things about classical liberalism if it's just being erased? And I think that's the difference. Right now, what I see happening is a a concerted effort to erase the social reproduction of our society, erase the cultural reproduction. Just it's not happening. And so we have a whole new tribe. It's a new tribe. It's not right, it's not left. It's this brand new blank globalist kind of herd of sheeple. I think Hayek, this would be a good time to bring in Hayek. They're serfs, right?
Yes. I think that is, it is terrifying. And before I bring in Hayek, I'll talk about a story that I had somebody on my podcast a couple years ago named Harry Wade, and he was a university student in Ontario. He was finishing his degree in engineering, but he was a very independent thinker. And, they had mask mandates and they had vaccine mandates. When they were bringing in the vaccine mandates, he was like, no, I'm going to finish my degree. Okay, I paid for this education. I'm going to school for engineering and I'm going to finish my degree. So he showed up at class. And it's very sad because he was arrested. I don't know if you ever saw this video of like a young guy getting dragged out of his university classroom.
Oh my God. I
Yeah.
don't think I did see it.
I'll send it to you. So he was arrested. What happened was he told me this in the podcast. The story behind it was that everybody would break the rules behind the scenes. So this, this new kind of herd that you're talking about, this is why I kind of brought this up. They would go to class, they would like put signs on the door, oh, study session. They would all take off their masks. They would do whatever they wanted, so they weren't really, really sticklers for the rules, behind the scenes. But whenever an authority figure was present, they would mask up. And I talk about the mask as well because it's just a symbol for everything else. So I think it's a good example here. So anyways, one day, when Harry shows up and he doesn't have his papers to show that he's vaccinated, they say, okay, the professor leaves to go get the police to come arrest him, to drag him off campus. And so when the professor leaves the room, the auditorium, hundreds of students sitting in there, they all take down their masks, all of them. And Harry thought, wow, this is the moment. This is the moment of solidarity. They're all going to stand with me. What do you think happened, Deb, when they came back? He came back with the police officer. Everybody put their mask back on. They watched Harry get dragged out. Nobody said a word. And he left, and he wasn't able to finish his education. He was expelled from school. And so what happened was that he was talking to me about not just the occurrence that led to his expulsion, but the state of the institutions themselves. And now, I'm in Canada, so I see Canada as being very advanced along this program that you're dealing with in the US as well. I think Justin Trudeau said before he became prime minister years ago that Canada would be the first postmodern state. And so that's terrifying. And we can see it happening. We can feel it happening in every aspect of our lives. And so Harry was saying that, I'm going to school to study engineering, but I'm learning about trans. I'm learning about climate change. I'm learning about things that have nothing to do with engineering. And he's like, these are going to be the leaders of the future. These are going to be the people who build your buildings. They're taking out anybody like me who doesn't want to be part of it. And he called it the hive mind. It was very chilling. So So what's to be done about all of this? Well, really, like, I mean, I don't know. I don't have all of the answers. I don't think any of us do. And I think it's so important to talk about these things. But what my instinct is as a parent is that you have to educate your child. And that's the way that it should be in the first place. So, the public institutions, public school and private schools too now, have come in to kind of fill this vacuum. And I think that this has been even more so since kind of the feminist revolution. Like I recall reading about an early, I think it was like a first or second wave feminist saying, like, we made a mistake, because now here we are. Um, we actually, instead of just being like la femme libérée, we're not just like liberated women, but we've got all the other stuff that we used to have to do too. So we're still running the household, we're still raising the children, we're still in charge of all the stuff that we were before. Plus now we have to have this other income. And of course the state loves it because now they're collecting taxes from other people. Women are voting, and women do vote differently, and I'm not against women voting, but that's a factor in there too. Um, and so all of this kind of, there was some things that backfired there. And now you have, women kind of being out of the home, children being raised by the state. So it's kind of like a progression of all of this stuff happening. It's like I have to send my kids to school because I have to work, right? Like for women, it's like there's not really many options, and we've had all of this economic malaise that's been going on for, I mean, I would argue since like the 1930s, since like the New Deal in America, and that was a trend, in the West, where there was like now decoupling from the gold standard, the creation of like a fiat money that was unpegged to anything else. And so just having this like consistent inflation, this money printing, this, government using Federal Reserve to finance, projects and things, and having a financial, um, uh, let's say, or an economic environment that is disconnected from the market. It's become a kind of like a crony kind of economic environment, and so it makes it harder for people to get by on top of everything else. So it's like both
And
of
then
the
they
parents have to
blame the
work.
market for it.
They blame
They
the free
say,
market.
yeah, that's what I loved about Malay's speech. He says, "Markets don't fail." And I
Oh,
I I watched it now 3 times. I cheer every time. It is the most hopeful, amazing thing I've ever seen. And it's part of what inspired me also to invite you on. Is what I loved about it was how I felt like he was almost channeling Solzhenitsyn in a way, like, just live not by lies, just tell the
mm,
truth. I'm going to stand here and I'm going to
yeah.
tell you the truth. Markets don't fail. I'm going to tell you the truth that if you think that something isn't working economically and you go, well, then the government's not involved, just look harder. You haven't looked closely enough.
Yes.
It's there. And this is what my husband says all the time, no matter what problem I bring up and I say, how can we address this? How can the West, blah, blah. And he says, separation of government and economy, period, full stop. I'm done.
Yes.
That's my answer.
Yes.
We're done, and he's not wrong.
Yep.
But what I realize is that we can't wait for, we're talking about, there's no like Superman. If Malay could like take over the United States, maybe we'd get it. But we don't have a Malay right now in the United States, sadly. And so how do you get to one? Well, I don't know the evolution of him or how this came to be. I don't know enough about that whole situation. But I do feel like people who think the way you and I do, we can keep having these conversations and we can keep talking, but I think we need to start behaving differently. My theory is that, and I think you already do this to a large degree. I think I do it to a large degree, but we might need to look for more opportunities. We need to look for opportunities in our lives to live free. So when it was COVID, it's a little, okay, I don't wear a mask. I don't get a vaccine. I go out anyway. I do what I want anyway. I live my life. I do what
Mhm.
I'm going to do. And what if there's consequences, I'm not going to change that. But I think even now that that's over and you don't have these super overt controls in your face, there are probably things we can do with the way we live each day, the things we consume, The things we buy, the things we sell, the things, the places we go, the people we interact with and give our business to and our time and attention to, that do the same thing, so that we don't live by lies. I am a free human being. I'm going to live a free human being. And if Justin Trudeau doesn't like it, or Joe Biden doesn't like it, or somebody doesn't like it, they're going to have to come to my door and physically stop me. Right. Because I'm just going to keep on going. And I think, it can come down to something as silly as, oh, should I buy this car or that car? Well, what car do you want to buy? Buy it if you can afford it,
Mm-hmm.
rather than be swayed in even the smallest way by, oh, you're a bad person if you do that. Or, do you want to eat meat? Eat meat. Don't fall to pressure of not eating meat. If you don't want to eat meat, don't eat meat. But it should be your reasoning. So I bet at this point that most people watching this are getting pressured some kind of way to change something about how they live, what they do, where they go, where they work. Even at work, you must attend the DEI training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm thinking to myself, if somebody said that to me and say, well, is this a requirement for my job that I have to physically go and sit in the training? Yes, you do. Okay. But then if I'm in the training and they're telling me I have to participate in certain ways, no, I don't have to do that. And I keep thinking of, there's a Tom Selleck played a character in a series of movies where he played a guy named Jesse Stone. And the people who hire him to be the town's chief of police keep saying, you realize we can fire you. You realize we can fire you. And he says, I realize that, but you can't tell me what to do.
Yes.
And I was just like, this is, there you go. There it is. And he carried that into Blue Bloods too. And I hate to reference everything to films and TV, but every time I see a nugget of truth, I'm like, relatable. That's so good. That's what it really comes down to, is you don't need to get all exercised about it. Just, that's true. You can fire me, or you can write me up, or you can do whatever it is you're going to do, but you can't control me. I control me. And I know that's really hard for people, because people think, then I'll get fired and I'll lose my job and terrible things will happen. I guess I would challenge people to think about, what is the worst thing in the world about that? Is that really the worst that could happen? Or is the worst that could happen is that you sell your soul? I mean, so the Milgram people, I really don't want to push the button. I hear screaming coming from the other side of the wall. So don't outsource your ethics and your morality. Try it. See what happens. I mean, that's my thing. And people tell me I'm insane. What do you think?
I live by that principle. I mean, like, my husband was captain of, an airline, and, a pilot for almost 20 years. Like, he gave up that career. We had to sell our house. We had to do all those things. We did it. We did it. We didn't die. We're still here, and we're thriving. We
It's like the character in the movie, in those movies, he goes, "Did you die?"
But it's hard. And I know, like, I understand why people did it. And they're like, they had a lot of legitimate excuses, like, you're like, I'm just gonna, okay, I'm gonna go to this DEI training because I can't lose my job. Like, listen, I understand not everybody can lose their job, but, you can start a business. You can decide, there are other options in life. If, like, the culture, like, it's like what your husband is saying too. Like, the solution, to, like, a kind of moving towards a corporatist kind of economy, or even I would argue we already are in many ways, is like, okay, well, do more things that are entrepreneurial, like start a business, like don't be reliant on somebody else. Like, yeah, you're going to have probably some red tape. Maybe try and get to a jurisdiction where you're going to have less red tape. If you need to move, you move. Like, we lived in a tiny, tiny apartment with a baby for a little bit so that we could, like, deal with the situation, because we had to do it. Like, it was either sell our souls. Like, there was no way that we are going to do something that we didn't want to do because the government was mandating it, or because the company was mandating it, like indirectly as a mechanism for the government mandates. So, I mean, it's like you have to have some courage, and you have to have faith in life, and you have to have faith that, like, if you do the things that are abiding by your principles that you decide, nobody else decides, if you're in line with your principles and your actions are in line with your principles, you have integrity. And that is going to give you enormous self-esteem. Integrity is crucial in self-esteem. And when you have self-esteem, you can do things. You just have to do them. You just have to start doing them, and it will happen. There's no um you know, perfect guidebook for how to change your life or how to start something new. Like, just start doing things one step at a time. And that's what me and my husband have been doing, and we're still doing that. And we're still evolving, and we're still figuring out different things in life. But I mean, for people out there who are afraid, because they don't want to step out of their comfort zone, and they have legitimate reasons. They have mortgages, they have children, they have expenses. It's this is what's so oppressive about this kind of ideological creep, is that it affects everybody where it hurts the most, which is financially. This is why, during the truckers convoy, people who donated to the truckers convoy had their assets and their bank accounts frozen,
Yep.
because this is where it hurts people the most financially. And these things are likely to continue in these trends. So I think, like, for people to try and see, this is what we're trying to do. How can you be more self-reliant? How can you be more economically self-reliant too? And that, actually ends up creating a system that is more of a market system.
That's right. Like
So
a parallel system. I keep saying we need to do that in education, because I've had so many people say to me, you're not going to get everyone to homeschool. Well, thank you. I'm pretty sure I knew that. But
yeah.
I understand that, but who said they had to? In other words, I'm not anti-school. I'm anti-government school. So
Yes.
it's almost like people forgot how many things we do still,
Mhm.
ironically, without the government arranging it for us.
Mhm.
So I mean, that's what I'm trying to get people to remind themselves of is, you parented a child from birth until you send them to school. How'd you pull that off? You did, right? You did, and
Mhm.
that's a tough time. I've had 3 kids. It's a tough time, that 0 to 6 or 7, if they're not in some kind of organized school, and that's usually for most people in most states, that's as early as it's kind of free, so to speak. So you came up with a way to pay for childcare or have them with a relative or friends or neighbors or, some little preschool half the day. Like, you found a solution and you made it work.
Mhm.
So all I'm suggesting is keep doing that.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
Yes.
how, and then they'll say, but I can't teach XYZ. And like, okay. Are you a gourmet cook? Are you a nutritionist? Are you a medical doctor? No. Why are you asking me these questions? And yet somehow you feed your child and it's
Yes.
not candy all day. And, when they have a boo boo or they have a fever, you figure out what to do next.
Yep.
So do you think maybe you have the wherewithal to figure out how to get access to the information they would need to learn the thing you would like for them to learn? And then comes the most sad thing that I hear. I don't know what they need to learn. And
Hmm.
I'm sort of befuddled because that slams, it's like when you're driving your car and you slam into a wall. And then I slam into the realization that for so long, people have depended on experts, and in this case, government certified experts, to tell them what their children need to learn, and they believe it completely without seeing any potential for conflict of interest. And
Yeah.
it and this is where you and I think have something, have something in common, in that this goes all the way back to where I'm a little kid. Like, I was that kid, that one with like, why? But why this and not that? And
Yeah.
I don't get who decided, And so I cannot conceive of thinking that way. I never so I don't know what to say other than you do. Right? I just answer straightforwardly and they look at me like I have 3 heads. How could I possibly do that? And again, I come back to the how do you pick to feed them? How do you pick how'd you pick where to live, what to drive, what to do? But this is different. It's really not.
It's one of the effects of the nanny state. This has like been the effect of it, is that like you trade off some of that freedom and some of that economic opportunity to be given simplistic answers for complex situations. And so it's basically like, people are not used to flexing that muscle, basically. But it is just a muscle that you have to flex. So you're like,
Mm.
okay, if I need to figure something out, like I can Google it now. We're so lucky. We live in such a wonderful age. Like I think the revolution of the internet is we can liken it to the invention of the Gutenberg printing press. Like
Mhm.
there's an explosion in potential there for what people can now learn on their own. Like you can literally pick up your phone and Google anything you want and get some answers and be able to compare those answers and see, so I think that you can learn how to do anything by yourself. And so the same thing comes for your children. Like you could literally Google, you could say, hey, my child is this old, like what what could they be learning? Like how could I homeschool them on this topic? Whatever. Like just you can find all of the answers all that you seek, and you can talk to people about these things. And I mean, it's some kind of insecurity because the nanny state um um creates a codependency with adults and has them feeling more infantilized, and so it's like that again comes to this idea of like individuation, like really like becoming yourself, like becoming a kind of full adult, an adult mind and soul, and in an adult's body, and not just being like a child in an adult's body. And I think, and I'm sympathetic to this because I had that, experience that's in some phase of my life too. Like it's a normal thing, but like eventually you have to pull yourself out of it because again, nobody's coming to save you. And I want to say something that's like related to Malay before, if you don't mind me going on this little tangent, because I don't want to
No,
forget. But when
please
you were,
do.
because you had brought him up, and I thought about this before our show as well, is like, we're talking about, I think you said, oh, maybe in the United States, if he were there, that could be better. But the thing is that nobody would vote for him in the US. Nobody would vote for him in Canada. The Argentinian people, or the Argentine people, sorry, they desire that because they have gone through all of the crap that we are headed towards and that we are, in the thick of in some ways. So they're on the other side of that. So they're like, okay, we want somebody to represent us. So he's not a savior. I think it's a really
No, that
important
is a
distinction.
really important point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, because I was about to be sounding like I was contradicting myself
No,
that,
no, but
he would come and say no, but no,
but
you're
but we
absolutely
all
right that you have to go through it. Mhm.
yeah, no, and I don't think that you were contradicting yourself, but I think like we have that kind of this mind frame, even for me, be like, oh man, it would be so cool if we had a guy like him, but like we would have a guy like him to reflect what the people want, what is
Right.
the will of the people. So I guess, coming back to education, it's kind of the same thing. Like maybe we need to go through things to be able to see them through. And again, there's some hope in this because in Canada, in some ways, we're like some of the most extreme far left states in the US, but everywhere. And I talk to friends who I consider like normies, people who are like part of that, they just kind of go along with whatever, they see on TV. And they are getting very worried and anxious and upset over what they see happening in their schools, what they see being taught to their children. They don't always necessarily feel empowered. And so I guess, like, part of the solutions, if you're thinking solutions based, it's like you're responsible for your child, they're under your care. So if my son were going to school, he's just under 3, but if he were going to school, and let's say that was the choice that I had, let's say, or let's say I could find a way to homeschool, but let's say I didn't go that route and I said, no, we're going to put him in public school or in private school, but I didn't like what was going on. Well, go talk to the principal. Go talk to, start at the local level. This is like, and again, this wraps in with Hayek. He wrote a famous essay called The Use of Local Knowledge in Society. It's like they always say nowadays, we need global solutions to global problems. No, we need local solutions to global problems. So go in there and sit in front of the principal face to face.
Right.
The same way like that little girl waved, the same way like I spoke with the woman who was in the
Right.
store with her daughter, and go talk to them as a human being to human being,
Right.
and find out what's going on.
You'll learn a lot. At a minimum, what it will do, because there are people watching here who might be listening to you from an American perspective and saying, "Oh, right, yeah, that's gonna work." And I get where they're coming from because I've been there. I've done that. I multiple times. Part of why I ended up on YouTube was my efforts at the local level did not work over a period of
Mm.
five years of trying and going face to face with people for my own children. I took responsibility. I mean, I didn't want them in the schools, but as I've told people on the channel many times, in a divorce situation, you don't always get your say. And I remember the realization when I was face to face with an English teacher. What happened was my seventh grader got in the car one day, very upset, started kicking the back of the seat, the front seat, saying, "I'm so frustrated." I said, "What happened?" She said, "Well, my English teacher told me today about the book we're reading that I am not supposed to see the characters in it as individuals, that they are representatives of groups." And I said, "Are you sure?" Like I thought seventh grade, I need to learn more about this. Maybe there's something getting lost in translation. So I let her finish explaining what was going on. I mean, she's a very smart kid and wouldn't lie, but I just want to make sure. So I got all the information. I asked for a meeting with the teacher. The head of school sat in on the meeting, and she said, "Okay, what can we do for you?" I said, "Well, can you clarify something for me? Is this what was said in class?" And the teacher sat up extra straight and very sure of herself. She's 20 something, but very sure of herself, said, "Yes, absolutely. Absolutely." Like proud of it. And I said, "Can you help me understand the reasoning behind what you're doing?" So before I jumped on her, I wanted to know, like, am I missing something here?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I said, because I'll tell you why I'm asking. I go to great lengths at home to teach my children to see people as individuals and not to judge people by any kind of characteristic, to really get to know them and so on. So that is part of why my daughter reacted the way she did, is she felt like this stood in direct contradiction of everything I've taught them since they were little, and they did homeschool in the first 3 years.
Mm.
So the teacher said, "Well, you have to understand that this little boy in the book is Hispanic and he has language skills because his parents have been here longer, and there's a new immigrant who doesn't have the language skills, so he can't access the education. And so these characters are representative of an oppressed minority, et cetera." So, and she's going through the whole thing. And I said, So the lesson is about his inability to access the education because of his language deficiency, that he doesn't have English as a first language. And she said, "Well, yes, they need to understand his struggle and how how hard it is and how much harder it is for him." And I said, "So what happens in the story?" I admit, I haven't read it. "Oh, well, the other boy helps him and helps him access the material." I said, "This sounds like a story about giving and helping and friendship. This sounds like a story about overcoming. This sounds like a story about, learning and growing. So is there a reason you're taking the approach of, instead of look at this boy and what a good friend he is to this other boy, and this is one of the ways we help each other in life, and versus these two boys are representatives of all people who don't speak English, who can't access education in America, because they are accessing it." I said, they're in a school where there are teachers and there's material and there's obviously a student who can help him. And I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying we can maybe do a little better, but it's a story. It's not a political treatise on how to do ESL. And I went through my little speech, and they looked at me like their eyes were spitting lasers. It was like, just what kind of monster are you to be saying this? And I just
You're
sat there,
so Western. You're
and
so
I'm
Western,
and I'm
Deb.
looking at these two women and just thinking to myself, like, what did I do? What did I say? And that realization is getting back to where I started. that taught me more about what I needed to do. So if before I was hesitant to fight really hard or try to get my kids out of this environment because I didn't want a conflict and reasons, my resolve went up 100%. My resolve to do whatever it took, move mountains, get out of the way. It's suddenly the coldness in their gaze, the realization that this wasn't just a school with people and teachers who had a difference of opinion from me. These people weren't competing for the mind of my child. These people were quite literally in competition with not me personally, but with the reality that I want my children to live in and grow up in. And that is my responsibility to acquaint them with reality. That was in competition with their narrative, their worldview. And it was my job, literally, to protect my child from that kind of game. That kind of it's like big game hunting, so to speak, for their brains. And I from that moment onward, I was just utterly committed to getting them out of there. And unfortunately, that didn't occur until COVID sort of brought things to a head and made it possible by default. But I am thankful every day that that was the last full year that any of my children had to be in anything resembling public school. And even then, there was still some damage done. Now they've come out of it and so forth, but I would tell parents to do what Kate is saying, because if you don't have a success with the person saying, "Oh, I understand, I hear your point of view, and here's what we can do to accommodate, or here's what we can do to take your concerns into consideration," at least you will see what you're up against.
Yeah. Yes.
And you will then, I promise you'll find the strength. If you look in their eyes and you see that they don't have your child's best interest at heart in the way you would like them to, it's amazing what that can do for a parent. It's really quite amazing. I've seen people who went from like, I could never to, "Oh, we're out of here," in
I
like
love
one or
that.
two conversations. I'm not saying it works for everyone, but sometimes you need that. Sometimes you need to see it up close and personal. And then the other thing, I love what you said about talk to other people and ask other people. Chances are somebody in your community feels the same concern and anxiety that you do. And you don't need more than 2 or 3 of you. You really don't need like a whole army of people to start something on your own. And then that brings more people to it, or just put your ideas together and say, how do we cover this? Here's where I work. Here's where you work. Here's what we're doing. What is it that we need? We have a childcare need. Okay. Let's see what,
Yes.
figure out. Does school have to happen between the hours of 8 and 6? Or can it happen on the weekends? Can it happen after I'm home? Can it happen early in the morning? Middle of the day at lunchtime because I can scoot home for an hour? Does it have to be what it is? Check your premises.
I
And
love that.
yeah, so that's kind of my answer from an education standpoint. But then you have the adult side, which is what you, I think, are better at helping people with what to learn and read. So to educate
I
themselves.
I think that that's really great, and like you said, like, I'm not there yet with my son, right? And so
Yeah,
it's like it's easy for me to kind of like imagine, what I could do in that context, but I'm gonna have to go through all of these things by myself
sure.
and see what works. But I do think that that's kind of like the whole point, is just like to have conversations, human conversations with people. As you said, you're gonna find out what is your answer. And then
That's
you
right.
can know where you stand and then what to do next. And it kind of ties back into that idea of like doing things one step at a time. And that's
Mm-hmm.
going to kind of, get you where you want to go. Like, no matter what the external circumstances are of life, if we go through this whole cultural revolution and like it's completely oppressive and suffocating, or like, will this kind of like individual resistance start to pan out differently in the aggregate way? I don't know, but like it's worth doing for yourself and for your family either
Right.
way. And it's interesting because your story that you were telling me, it has me thinking about this book that I'm reading right now. And I'm not done. I'm like 40% of the way through, I think, according to Kindle giving me the little stats on the bottom. And
Exactly.
it's called Lolita in Tehran.
Ooh.
And it's about, I think you would love it, Deb. It's about the Islamic Republic in Iran, the revolution back in the 70s. And it's through the perspective of an educator. She was a professor at this University of Tehran. And she was kind of like a lefty, kind of a revolutionary in her youth. But then the far left paired up with the Islamists to overthrow the Shah, and then everything changed. So what I'm reading about right now in the last few chapters is they put the book Great Gatsby on trial because it was no longer a book that like exactly what you were describing with your daughter, how this book is being looked at through this critical theory lens of like who's the oppressed, who's the oppressor, not looking at it through anything else, was exactly the example I was reading about in this book, Lolita in Tehran. So they're looking at the Great Gatsby in this English literature class, who the author is the professor of. And you have the communists saying, well, it's just a bourgeois decadent kind of novel. And you have the Islamists saying it's like all about American materialism. And like nobody's actually looking at what the book itself is actually about. And so
Right.
this is kind of what the author is getting to. And she writes something that's so, so poetic and so beautiful, but I'll try and paraphrase it. And she says, the reason that you read literature is to have empathy with the characters and with the story, to try and get into somebody else's world. It's not about judging like whether, it was right that Daisy and Gatsby were having an affair or whatever. Like it's not about that kind of looking at it through the lens of oppression. Well, or Daisy just wanted to go after somebody who was rich and it's all about money. And it's, looking at it through all these are critical theory lenses, like trying to deconstruct things to make it about the oppressed or the oppressor, or like, American values versus like, the or the colonial, the colonizers versus the indigenous peoples. Like it's all of these kind of like paradigms that you're applying to stories, but like they're stories. And that's kind of the point, is that these are not meant to be read that way. And I think that this is why um it's so damaging, all of this critical theory stuff. The author of this book gets to it, is that by looking at everything, by deconstructing it, you're not actually able to have empathy and to have understanding of the experience, the imaginary experience that you're supposed to go through when you read a piece of literature. And it's that imaginative experience of putting yourself in the shoes of someone else or understanding what they were going through that actually allows you to kind of become more connected with your own humanity. So like all
100%.
of these things are just like pulling all of that away, and that's what probably irked your daughter in a way too, right?
Yep.
It's like you're dehumanizing the characters by doing that, by saying, "Oh, these are just, um people who are being oppressed or they're treated unjustly in the system." And so I don't know, it's got to be really really tough to be somebody your children's age, and for parents too, of like, you guys are in the middle of all of this. I don't know what it's going to be like in a few years for my son, but I feel for you. It must be really tough.
It's it's hard, but I will tell you it's a lot easier when they're not in the school. It can be a little lonely because even when they go out and try to make friends, they're running into kids who are getting these messages. Even within the homeschool co-op, there are still kids who consume things like TikTok and whatever. We don't all have the same exact standards for our parenting, even in the homeschooling community.
Yeah.
And so they'll, use ways of like approaches to problem solving and interacting with others that you can tell derive from social media. They're more affected and they seem to talk in like sound bites and especially after October 7th, it became very, very challenging for my daughter. Um, because she took what I believe to be the correct approach, which is, look, I don't know enough about what's going on because I shielded her from the worst of it. I wouldn't allow her to look at some of the footage. And I don't think a 15-year-old needs to be that well acquainted with
No.
what was going on.
No.
Just bad things happened and now there's a war and they were defending themselves is kind of like the gist of it. But that's it. And her approach was, look, we at our age shouldn't be taking such a hard stand if we don't know enough about it. So she said, look, I'm Jewish, so I support Israel's right to exist, and I support Israel's right to defend itself. And if Hamas attacked Israel, then Israel has a right to defend itself. And that's the beginning, middle, and end of my opinion. Kind of like, I'm done talking about it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Which for 15, I think is appropriate. That's about where you should stop. And she was running into people the same age and even younger who were just, everything you see in the street, everything you hear on the college campuses, firing back at her and making it about how, because she's Jewish, she needed to answer for all of these things. And she just said, I don't want to talk about this. I'm not doing this. And she would even ask at times, like, where are you getting this information? So they didn't have, it was just repeating stuff.
Slogans.
Slogans and whatnot. And this got in between some friendships, and I'm very proud of the way she handled it. Just like, I'm not getting sucked into this because this is not my thing. But at the same time, I could feel the frustration. Like, can't I just be a kid? Can't I just be 15 and be in high school? And it's not happening to me here. Not in a callous way, but in a way of like, there's only so much I can take on as a 15-year-old human, and I cannot get that involved. And so I, as a parent and as a teacher, look at some of the things that our schools are putting on children. And these are very big, heavy topics that even adults are wrestling with. Adults are trying to figure out, where do I stand? What do I think about this? And, there's the response. There are small parts of the response. There is the overall, what's going to happen next. There are many facets to this. And with the tribalism thing, people are encouraged to go all in one way or all in another way. Lickety split. And this is whether it was Michael Brown getting shot or George Floyd or, January 6th or October 10th. These things become flashpoints for tribal alignment. And, you even covered the thing with Bob Moran in the cartoon, which was wonderful, by the way. And I was like cheering, like, yes, my thoughts exactly. That guys, we can do better. We don't need to comment on everything. And when we do comment, we should understand like where we're coming from. Like, don't, what do I think and why do I think it? Okay, now I'm going to say something. And that's it. And own it. My concern with him was he wasn't owning it. He was like pretending it wasn't what it was. I'm like, dude.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
you played the victim. I think, it's like the thread that ties all of those things together, Deb, is the dehumanization. It's like your daughter was dehumanized by her friends and or associates, or
it was like friends of friends, but
maybe
still.
right. I don't know the situation, but like by the people who you're talking about, it ties in with the cartoon. It ties in also with the people who are acting as revolutionaries right now. They're being brainwashed to become like revolutionaries, and it's exactly like this book that I'm reading right now. And this is why it's so timely, because it was really this coalition between the communists and fundamentalist Islamists. And this is, we're seeing the same fusion right now. So I totally recommend it to anybody who wants to go down that kind of rabbit hole, because you get this picture that the common thread is dehumanization, objectification of people, and not seeing anybody as just like a human being who has, the kind of, who is entitled to some kind of basic dignity and respect, like it, I don't see, people, for example, like in this particular scenario, like what's happening to your daughter. Like she's not doing that. She's not saying, "Oh, well, these people are blah blah blah." Like it's just like, I don't want to, I don't want to be put in this situation now where I have to get into this kind of debate with you. And then she's being dehumanized for that, right? But she's not trying to dehumanize somebody else. And so I think that, that's the kind of, that's the like, you can't have collectivist movements without the dehumanization aspect. So,
Mm,
like, the sooner that we can kind of individually practice that in all of our relationships, the kind of basic respect for the people around us, and not try to see them as it's, or as objects, or as something, that's not as human as us, really. That's what it
right.
is. And it comes back to the COVID stuff. It comes back to looking at people in the store, like, if you were not wearing a mask, but you considered yourself part of the anti-masker tribe,
Mm-hmm.
and you would see somebody in the store with a mask, and you would be thinking all kinds of angry thoughts in your head because you see this other person. And this is like fueled by all of the tension, right? And now we're like kind of seeing all of this tension explode, but it's creating like an even more dangerous collectivism than I think we had from 2020 until kind of the kind of end of the COVID era, because like it hasn't really ended. It's all like that. 2020, the seeds were there. The collectivist seeds were there already. Uh and then that kind of just like kicked it off,
Yep.
and just like turned up the temperature. And now it's just going higher and higher and higher and higher, and people are joining the biggest mob in the world. And so I think, like, thinking of the youth and of that generation and of children and of people who are dealing with now their kids at that point in their life, I think it's just important to teach them that it's okay to think of yourself and to think of the people around you, and to not have to look at yourself as like oppressive because you're white,
Mm-hmm.
or because you're Jewish, or because anything else. I think that that's like what these, because then that's exactly like coming back to our kind of main idea of this: people who think somebody's going to save them. It's like that's what mobs go for. They're like,
Yes,
"Oh, we're gonna have some kind of savior come in." And then that's when you get actual dictators. That's when you
absolutely.
get people who will take that ring of power and they will wield it to their benefit, and then all of the people will be subjugated. And then this is the story that we see play over and over and over again in history. And the exception to that, is the American experiment. And I, as a Canadian, appreciate this so much, because America was based on ideas. It
Yes.
wasn't based on tribal uh similitudes, or it wasn't like, okay, we're of the same ethnicity and the same language and the same culture. It was based on ideas. And if you subscribe to these ideas, then you're welcome to participate in the country and
Right.
grow it from the ground up, from the bottom up. And that's what's amazing about America. And this is why I think what's going on right now, this kind of indoctrination of the youth, has to be so subversive, because there are pretty good checks and balances, but they're being decayed, and they're being degraded over time. And so, other countries like Canada, you're able to go in there and you don't have as many protections in the law. So you can go do all kinds of things. But
Sure.
in America, there's still that kind of, you know, there's those checks and balances, but moreover, there are also people who still believe in those principles.
That's true. But I mean, tragically, fewer of us than there ever have been, because where would 99% of our population get the information that these checks and balances exist to enforce them? So the checks and balances, along with our civil rights, really only exist on paper. They exist on paper, and they exist in the minds of those people that want to uphold them and will uphold them, the people who took those oaths of office and actually meant it. But as long as the majority of the population can't read, and I mean, are, functionally illiterate, and certainly couldn't tell you what any of the rights in the Bill of Rights are. I've actually met people, teenagers, but still, if you ask them what the Bill of Rights is, they don't know. And if you ask them to name one of the rights iterated in the Bill of Rights, they can't think of one. They can't even come up with the First Amendment. Never mind the second or the
That's
third or the
crazy.
fourth or the fifth. And if you put in front of them, people have done this experiment, if you put in front of them a completely different country's constitution and ask them, if it's the United States Constitution, or they'll say yes. They just guess, like, is this right? They don't know. So if you're not,
Wow.
there are immigrants to our country who know more about our country than native born, for the reason that you gave. They came here because they wanted to live in a place that
Yeah.
had the ideas. Um, and so as a person who covers education, that's my biggest concern, is that we can't effectively fight back because we don't know we're being oppressed. We don't know. In fact, you might recall during COVID, people like me would say, "This is oppressive. You're taking away my freedoms," and then people would come back, "My freedom,"
Oh, yeah.
and they'd
I
make fun of
know.
you, and they would
Became
say,
like a
"Oh,
meme.
you're so oppressed," and you're
Yeah.
like, did you forget freedom of association, freedom of speech? Like, just even the freedom to assemble. We have a right to freely assemble in the United States. It's actually spelled out as protected as a natural right. And people don't know that. I was present at a protest in Raleigh, the capital of North Carolina, where I live. And I went to the first sort of walk away, or a reopening, not walk away, reopening protest. And it was peaceful, of course. We were there, people had cars, and we just had signs, and we were gonna, walk around the streets. It was even on a weekend. Wasn't gonna disturb anybody's going to work time. And we began, I think there were probably about 500 of us gathered to just walk around the Capitol, where the General Assembly and everything meets. Police came out with a bullhorn and said, "You need to go away. You're violating quarantine or something. You're violating the stay-at-home orders, whatever, and we're going to start arresting people." And I just stood there and I said, "But what?" So now most people immediately went back to their cars. My husband and I stayed till there were like maybe 20 or so left, and then the cops were heading towards us. We're like, we have kids at home, and we
Let's
need to go
go.
home. We gotta go." One woman,
Crazy.
one woman stood her ground on a public sidewalk, and she got arrested. And it became a big thing, and, the governor ended up being in the wrong, and so on. But it really disturbed me that the police carried out this order. That's really what stood out to me. It wasn't just that the people went home. I mean, after a point, you're like, they have guns and you don't, and of course you're gonna leave. But unless you can get arrested and it's not gonna affect you. Uh, but the police carried out the order, which means the police officers did not know that they were violating the civil rights of the people, which they are duty bound not to do in the
Mhm.
United States of America. I mean, probably in Canada too, but it 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 was such a moment. It was such a moment where I realized, like, we don't know. I mean, I know, and many others do, but increasingly the younger generation does not know, and even some of the people who are in positions of power don't know. It's not a question of I know and I'm gonna go ahead and do it anyway. It's we didn't realize that the guy in charge told us to do something, so we did it. We were just following orders. Like, that's an order you are duty bound to reject. If you're in the military and they say go out into the streets in the United States and start shooting people, you're duty bound to say no,
Mhm.
not doing that. And if we get to a point where enough people in America don't know the rights, it won't matter what they are. It won't matter what the checks and balances are supposed to be. They simply won't be honored. We have courts in the country already behaving that way. There are some that are upholding, thank goodness. So we've got like pockets,
Yep.
these 50 different states. But education to me is so important for that reason. And this is what I tell parents too. If you want your kids to know what their freedoms are, to be able to defend them, you're going to have to teach it to them because they will not be taught in school. That's just a fact.
I was spending some time this weekend with my parents. My great grandparents fled the Soviet Union in the 1930s, early 1928, 1930. I don't know how they even got out at that point, okay? And I was looking at these old documents, right? And I was like, thank God you have these documents, mom, because like these pieces of paper, handwritten things on them, and passports and all of these, tickets that saying this is the boat we took across to come to North America. These are kind of like these documents that if we don't have, like, the story dies. And if you don't have them and you pass them on to me and I pass them on to my children, then the story dies. And then the history is gone. And we'll never know what happened. We'll never know what happened to Baba. We're never going to know what the story is. We'll never be able to piece it together. And I fear that that's where this is headed, if there isn't, as you said, like, this education um of principles and of the law.
Yeah.
And of the ideas of, like, why this, why we're here now, like, why we're able to have all of this that we have around us. It doesn't take that long
Mm-mm.
to take freedom away. But if the ideas are still there and they're not forgotten, but it only takes, 1 or 2 generations to forget. If they
Right.
don't have it, if they don't know, if they're not reading the Bill of Rights, their children won't. That's
And
1 generation away.
it fortifies you too. I recommend that people do it, even if you think you know. And you think, well, I'm a freedom defender and I know my rights, whatever. I still would recommend. I keep this on my desk. Declaration of Independence and
I love
Constitution.
it. I
It's
love it.
very well thumbed through. But I would I recommend going back, and this is why I asked Kate for sort of a reading list, because you read an enormous amount. I recommend that people, no matter how old you are, re-educate yourself about your rights, your freedoms, how the law works. Look at your own state or your own province. What is it supposed to be? What was in the document before they shred the documents or rewrite them completely? Make sure you have current copies. Read that. It fortifies you. It gives you the strength to do things like what the truckers did, or what we did when we went out and we protested, or just pulling your child out of the school and saying, come what may, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to, when it's hard, on the day it's hard and I'm not sure that the sitter's coming or whatever's happening, I'm going to remind myself, because I know that I'm protecting this. If it lives in you, it lives.
Yes.
If you give it to your children, it lives. So freedom is an idea. Liberty is an idea. These rights are important ideas that do not die as long as they live inside you, in your brain, and you pass it on to somebody else. There may come another day, just as it did with East Germans who lived long enough to see it, and Soviets, Soviet Jews who lived long enough to see it and get out, and others, where it really mattered. That's how the wall came down, in part. That's how these things do get better. They can get better. But I genuinely believe, like you said, you need that local solution, really local to you first,
Yeah.
the local solution to this global problem of mass psychosis. There is no one person or party or platform that's going to come along and make it all better. I realize it is so tempting to want that. Wouldn't we all want that? But that has never existed. And people say, what about Reagan? Or what about the, you're romanticizing the past.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously it didn't work, because look where we are. Oh, but the 80s were great. Were they though? I mean, for some people they were, for other people they were terrible. It
Yep.
just depends who you ask. And the problem didn't get solved, I would argue, because I've read the documents. It actually just quietly got worse. There was a surface veneer of something being better because you felt better.
Yes.
It made you feel good about your country for a while. Look, I did too.
Mm-hmm.
But in actual fact, your rights continued to be undermined just the same. How do you think we got here? So, it's actually never happened that way. And I think you made a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up about Millet, that 80 years had to go by of some really bad stuff in Argentina before you could even get MLA. And my dad used to say that. He said, leaders and good leadership comes out of the real need for it. Good leader. No,
Yes.
I'm not talking about like the dictator types, but the type,
Yep.
and that's not one person necessarily. Leaders can be like we had with the framers of our Constitution and the founders of our
Yes.
country, just people who really mean to lead you out of Egypt. Okay. That comes with necessity. And I don't think we're there yet. I think things are still too shiny and happy for people.
I think so too, unfortunately. And but, like, the kind of the thing that I try and do, that I think like what you can do, is like figure out kind of like what are, like your priorities in life, and say, okay, do I really prioritize like financial freedom? Do I really prioritize like psychological freedom, spiritual freedom? Like, and I try and work on each of those like pillars, and
Yes,
and say, okay, like, look, if I'm psychologically free, I'm not going to be as miserable like every time some leader says something or does something, or you know, like, you can be like, okay, we know that this is how it is. Okay, you're
yeah,
psychologically free, you're less affected, so you can
exactly.
actually have happy days. Like, and your life is made up of days. It's not just like this, there's the big picture, but there's the everyday picture too. Like, you can have fun with your kids, you can eat good meals, you can laugh, you can listen to great music, you can dance, you can have joy in your life. So like psychological freedom, and that psychological freedom too, also, as you were alluding to before, Deb, makes you less susceptible to
Yes,
propaganda. So
very
you
much
can
so.
actually kind of see more clearly. So same thing, like financial freedom, geographical freedom. Like, okay, do I need to move? Should I go to another country? Like, if this, am I going to get better opportunities somewhere else? So these are, the kinds of things in the big picture of life. Like, I think more and more now, especially since I've become a mother, it's like our time is finite here on this earth, and like, there's no reshuffling of the decks here. Like, we're not coming back for the next round. So
Not a dress
okay, so
rehearsal, no.
yeah, what do I want to do? And I think that's, what do I want for me, for my family, for my kids? What kind of values do I want to imbibe in them? And then just do step by step, like I'm trying to do step by step. What do I need to do to kind of like set this all up? And it's an
Yeah,
ongoing process.
yeah, for sure. All right, so before we finish, because I've kept you so long, what are you mentioned already? One book that remind me again. So, what should we read? Give us your top things that you think really help ground people in principles or understanding these kinds of ideas.
So many things, but I would say definitely like number one would probably be Friedrich Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. It's a great lesson in macroeconomics, but it's not really a book that's about economics. It's more about, like, or solely about economics. It's not dry. It's a book about, the philosophy of collectivism. And he wrote it in 1942, I believe. So this was like, he wrote it urgently and said, okay, there's something we need to discuss right now, because like, look what's going on in Germany, and look, all of these fascist movements springing up everywhere, the communist movements. So this was like really about these ideas. I think that that's an essential piece of reading that will clarify things for so many people, and you can go back to it time and time again. And then the other one I would go for would be Viktor Frankl, Man in Search of Meaning. This is
Mhm.
about, again, a concentration camp survivor who, while he was there, just prior to that, had been working on this idea called logotherapy. So therapy in search of meaning. And not, he said Freud saw everything as like, repressions of the psyche having to do with your parents. Adler saw things in power dynamics, but he said, the real kind of answer that he was starting to figure out for the psyche was finding meaning in your life. And in fact, he said, instead of the pursuit of happiness as this American ideal, it should be the pursuit of meaning, which will lead to happiness. So I
I
thought that that
agree.
was really great. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then just there's so many great books, but one for fun, if you want to go into kind of the history, like, and reading through the lens of a story of what actually happened, when there was this overthrow of the Shah in the what is now the Islamic Republic of Iran, pairing with the communists and trying to basically like destroy the existing culture, destroy literature, destroy education, indoctrinate the new generation. Like, it's very you can apply it quite literally to some of the things that we see today. So I'd suggest that one. I forget the name of the author, I'm sorry, but it's called Lolita in Tehran.
Got it. Okay, awesome. And then I highly recommend that everybody who is not currently subscribed to Kate's channel and her website, and I'm going to bring those up again just to refresh your memory. So we have the YouTube channel. It's just at Kate Wand.
Yeah.
Just so many great interviews, so many great opinions too. Even just your shorter takes on things are
Thank you.
really get you thinking. It's brain food. And then we have this. I just love this. The solution to collectivist problem is an individual one. It is so true. I have a T-shirt that I ever said. I keep wishing I wish I had time to go back and redesign it without my branding on it, because I didn't realize that you shouldn't put your brand name on it. But it says "Ally of the Individual," because
Oh, I
people are
love
working on these
that.
allies, whatever. I'm like, well, I'm an ally of myself, or just the
I
individual,
love
the
that.
person out there like that. And I have one other one that says, I don't hate people. I hate ideas that hate people,
That's great. That's
because
fantastic.
that's the problem, isn't it? It's not people who are your problem. It's really bad ideas that are living inside of people. So if you want, and Carrie Smith has talked about this too. She's talked about how what she was like before when she was under the spell of collectivism and working with Hollywood and so forth. And then when she sort of woke up and changed that and started living her own life and being an individual and so on. And she even showed pictures side by side of herself. She said, look at the difference even in my appearance. You can see like light, like she just looks like a happier person. She looks like light is emanating from her. Whereas the others is this kind of like, even when she was smiling, that's not a person who's truly finds meaning and happiness. And I think it really does change you from the inside out and make your life better, even if everything going on outside of you is cray cray. Um, so
Yes. I agree. You know what? I could totally relate to that. My life is so much better now, and the state of the world is so much worse. So
isn't that amazing?
uh,
It's so, so true. So I thank you so, so much for joining me and for sitting down and having this conversation. Like I said, I'm a huge fan. Come back anytime. And I will be watching and reading and listening to your work from now on. You do great things. Thank you to everybody else who has joined us today. Again, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and to Kate's channel. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.